This is The Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solarpunk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
My name is Anna. I live in the United States. I'm Armenian, like Karena. And I have a background in law and human rights. And that's it. I really like to sew. There's a lot of sewing equipment like in the immediate background of this video.
My name is Karena, Avedissian. I am also Armenian, as Anna mentioned. I have a background in academia. I have a PhD in social movements and Russian studies, but currently I am a copy editor for EVN Report, which is an independent news outlet in Armenia. And I also work on disinformation and political communication. Yeah.
So I've been pronouncing y'all's last name in the way we do so in Lebanon, and I actually have no idea whether it's accurate.
Try it.
It's just Avedissian.
Yeah.
We would say the yan. Okay, cool. Okay. Cool.
I'm saying it the American way.
Right. Yes. Okay. So it is actually Kardashian, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
I'm assuming that's how they say it at home as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we have a lot to go through today. It's actually ridiculous, the number of bullet points that we set out for ourselves. We'll see what we're going to do. The main thread will be around, and this is what I wrote, Armenian-ness and how the Armenian struggle, especially... What the fuck did I... Sorry. Yeah, how the Armenian-ness and how the Armenian struggle relates to other historically oppressed peoples. How has it changed over time, maybe, and obviously in current context, given that there's so much that has happened in the past year. By the time this is out, I think it will be 1 year since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has started. So February, yeah, more or less. So obviously we'll talk about that as well. But I guess I'll just ask you to kind of start us off by telling us how have you been talking about this topic on your own podcast. Obviously mention your podcast. This will be on your podcast as well. Obscuristan or Obscuristan. And yeah, Stian. And we will just take it from there, I guess. So how have you thought about this phenomenon, this identity, Armenian-ness, and how would you define its very complicated positionality and place in the world today?
Our podcast, Obscuristan, is really about Eurasia. So honestly, the former Soviet Union without calling it that. And one thing we've noticed, and I think perhaps the war in Ukraine is one of the pushes, one of the triggering kind of events happening in the world that pushed us to actually start the podcast, because we wanted to hear more kind of decolonial conversations around Armenian identity in the region. And we just weren't hearing that. And we wanted to speak from a broader perspective, like not only as two Armenian women talking about Armenia and Armenian-ness, but, kind of broadening the scope. And one of the things that we've noticed, at least I've noticed on Twitter, is these conversations that have been spearheaded by Ukrainians around decolonizing their identity was being picked up a lot by Central Asians, a lot of thinkers in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And this is something we've noticed is kind of missing from Armenian discourse. And there's reasons for this, and they're historical and political, and especially with, regards to the current situation around Artsakh and Azerbaijan and the kind of existential threat that Armenians are facing right now, the position of the Russian peacekeepers, in quotations. And I feel like the geopolitical situation is a huge obstacle to a lot of these kind of critical thinking, critical discourse that we could be having around this, and kind of plugging into these broader conversations that people are having and learning from one another, and also, offering our perspective, because I think it is unique. They're all unique. But I think that because we're not participating in these conversations, there's a big piece missing that would contribute to everyone's understanding of what it means to be kind of post-Soviet.
Yeah, Karena gave a really, really good background of like what pushed us to start the podcast. There's also kind of this element of like Armenia. You mentioned positionality, which is like one of the worst words ever, but super important. Because Armenian identity has been kind of screwed up by like a lot of experiences with empire, obviously a lot of experiences with genocide. But something that like isn't often recognized and that people don't realize from the outside is that like there's a there's a distinct identity between being an Armenian in the diaspora, between being an Armenian in Armenia, and also like between all of the historic positions that come with that. So there are Eastern Armenians and Western Armenians, and for better or for worse, those come with different baggage, and it comes with a lot of the same baggage because we interact together and we have a shared history. But there's like also a distinction there, and it messes with the positionality of who we are. There's also difficulty because Armenians exist in a lot of other countries, and so our positionality in those countries is also important and different than what our positionality in Armenia is, which I notice gets really screwed up in the United States because like of how white supremacy works. How white supremacy works in the United States and how racism works in the United States and how like connected and pervasive it is and connected to chattel slavery it is. So Armenians' positionality when it comes to race in the US is very different than our position as a global minority, as like a people in our native land and our indigenous land. And I think that is not something that Armenians have advocated very well around historically in the United States, but it's also not something that's like very easy to explain to what is a like global conversation within leftism that's very Western focused, because it's pretty hard to make sense of that even for ourselves, and like trying to explain it outwards that like, well, we occupy one position here and one very, very, very different position on our indigenous lands is also really complicated, especially as like the U.S. exports the U.S. leftists export their own racial politics and their own ethnic politics onto the rest of the world. So that's a couple of words about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can already identify a lot. Obviously, I'll try and express myself well. I've tried a number of times, and I think it always came out just badly. Like, it just hasn't been a completed thought because it's such a complicated thing for me. I grew up, obviously, in Lebanon, and in Lebanon, Armenians are just one group like the other groups, right? Like you have Shias, you have Sunnis, you have Maronites, and then you have Armenians. And within Armenians, you have Catholics, and you have, all of that stuff. And I'm reminded of a frankly ridiculous interview with a Lebanese Armenian politician whose name I don't remember. It was a long time ago. And he was being asked by the host, another Lebanese woman, do you identify as Armenian or Lebanese? And because, of course, having more than one identity is too complicated. And he responded something that it's just glued to my mind, right? Like he said, I'm Lebanese by identity and Armenian by sect. Because in Lebanon, everything has to have the main identity, their OG identity, which is Lebanese. And then, you could subsume the rest of them. You can you have a sub-identity, which is your sect. And this was his way, actually. I'm sure, I don't remember who he was, but maybe in some ways he was just trying to be diplomatic in his answer, in the sense that in Lebanon, as I said, you have all of these sub-identities and whatnot, but it's usually bad form to primarily identify with your sect before identifying with your nationality, in at least publicly. Privately, people do it. So maybe this was his way of speaking to that audience, right? But this is why for me, like and hopefully we'll get into it a bit more, but when I actually went to Armenia in 2015, I went there with a certain baggage, right? Like what I thought Armenian-ness might be. I had done a bit of research. I had done, not Armenian-ness, but what Armenian culture, for lack of a better term, would be. I had done a bit of research. I've done, read some stuff and whatnot, but I was mostly there on kind of just, it was the centennial of the genocide. So I was there kind of as a reporter more than anything. I didn't have much time to do else. And then I went there with a couple of Lebanese Armenian friends from Beirut to Yerevan. There were direct flights for that occasion. And they told me that they actually don't understand much of what folks in Yerevan were saying. It's not necessarily just the language. Of course, I know that the language is very different, or at least, whatever, it's different. But just in terms of like, when they were there, they identified as Lebanese. And I found that very interesting because in Lebanon, most Armenians, maybe it's a cliche, but most Armenian would say like, I'm Armenian. They would say I'm Lebanese too, but they would say I'm Armenian. Like it's something that is mentioned. Whereas one of the first things I remember upon arriving in Yerevan is, like basically that they see themselves as Lebanese Armenians going to Armenian Armenians. They would say Armenian Armenians twice. Arman. They would say it twice. Like OG Armenians or something. But yeah, so this is what I sort of have in mind, and this is why for me, the Armenian context has always felt kind of a kindred context, one that is different. It's not the same. There are lots of differences, but it's also like not entirely alien to me in that sense because I've had this a bit of a background. So anyway, those were a lot of words as well.
I really relate to your friends. Oddly enough, in a different way, because I grew up in the US and then I basically was educated in the UK, and I felt super American when I was in the UK. So it's just kind of, I guess, when you're confronted with this kind of opposing, kind of conflicting identity, the other piece of you seems to kind of stand out more. Like the contours of it are just sort of more obvious. And my background is also, I'm not Armenian-Armenian, I'm Persian-Armenian, so my family's from Iran. And I come from that culture, and there's, obviously still Armenian and speaking Armenian in the home to some extent. My little brother actually doesn't speak Armenian, but, we're kind of different in that sense because we've lived in Iran for at least 400 years, in some cases longer. And it's something that you feel also in interactions with other people, because sometimes they'll kind of treat you differently as a diasporan, also depending on where you come from. Sometimes I'll tell people I'm a diasporan and they'll ask me, are you from Beirut? Because they're just more familiar with that. Are you Lebanese Armenian? I'm like, no, I'm Persian Armenian. They're like, oh, okay. So
this is the only context in which Lebanon is kind of known, or one of the few contexts.
Yeah, Lebanon's like the center.
Yeah, it's just one of the few contexts in which I've heard, no, I'm actually from Beirut, or are you from Beirut? And because where else would that pop up?
Yeah, it's like a pretty familiar place. Like it's a very central place in Armenian identity, as much as Yerevan or
absolutely.
Other places have become very central to Armenian identity, as much as places that people would associate with Armenians. It's also worth noting that it kind of creates a difficulty with Armenian advocacy, because most Armenian advocacy outside of Armenia is obviously done by Armenians who aren't from, or not. We actually don't know the numbers on this, but not that they're not from Armenia, but they're not living in Armenia. And a good chunk of them, like half or less than half, or maybe more than half, are Western Armenians, so many of them may not even have relationships to Armenia that are substantial, is like I think a good way to put it. Some people some of them have never been to Armenia, which is fine. Some of them have, no connection to it in terms of it's not a place that they have like a regular or even sort of like a personal connection to. And that changes what Armenian advocacy looks like, because it changes the centrality of issues. It changes your positionality within the Armenian community, and it creates really kind of difficult. It creates really difficult conversations because it can sort of veer into judging Armenian-ness, when in reality it's a very real question of there are, there's a conflict. There is sort of like a crisis right now, and there has been for a while. And in advocating for that or about that, you always want to send, like, in any form of advocacy, you always want to center people closest to the conflict. You always want to center people like absolutely most affected by the thing that you're advocating for. And that becomes very difficult in the Armenian community because we all have a shared history of trauma. We all have a shared history of like connection to erasure. But, you know, sort of the voice of people from the Republic of Artsakh or Artsakhtsis or Karabakhtis, like it's kind of used interchangeably. Like it can get, they're so small and there's so few of them that it can get erased, even within Armenia itself. But I wanted to kind of go back and zoom out as to like why that happened and what that is, because like, yes, there are historical, like, you know, like subgroups within the Armenian community, but some of that is also like deliberately some of that is deliberately inflated by the history of empire. So Armenians are a people who've lived under many different empires and who've historically been like have transcended borders. Like Armenians as a group have always had identity for most of their own history, or most of our own history, across state or like state-like lines. So even when they were distinct entities that, you know, were governing them, Armenians sort of like traversed that, which created a really like, I mean, kind of a cool culture, because on the one hand, like while Eastern Armenians who were living under the Russian Empire were obviously deeply influenced by Russianness and by Russian identity and by Russian culture and by the culture of, you know, the Caucasus and Caucasus groups like, you know, Georgians, Dagestanis, Abkhazians, etc. They were also still fundamentally connected to like further west. So they were more connected to, I guess, like what you would now describe as the Middle East, to Middle Eastern culture, to Levantine culture. And that created like a sort of different group identity because they always were connected both to their empire and also out beyond, which is, I don't know, kind of an interesting history to think about. But I want us to like get into a little bit of the connections to our imperial cultures a little bit, because I think it's like we started by talking about the war in Ukraine, and my experience in looking at the Armenian community when the war in Ukraine started was really bizarre, because as somebody with a lot of connections to Russia, to Ukraine, to like having family in Ukraine and things like that, like it was like my reaction was one thing, but seeing Armenians who had very little connection to that had a very different reaction to it. And so like people would ask me, like especially like, you know, like my Indian friends here, like their parents especially would be like, oh, like what do Armenians think of the conflict in Ukraine? And I'd be like, I don't know. I don't want to answer this question. Like I really know. But yeah.
Can you?
So, I mean, we can get into that.
Yeah, I wanted to add something onto that actually with what Anna was saying. I mean, there's this, you know, historical legacy that also, you know, impacts that. Anna touched on a lot of that. I think one of the most kind of interesting things for me is to remember how after the 1915 genocide, so many Armenian refugees and orphans ended up in Beirut and created a new life, essentially, and one in which there was, you know, kind of a strong boundary, I would guess. I don't know too much about it, but they were super Armenian. They were able to do commerce, educate, you know, have a civic life, and everything was conducted in the Armenian language. And to the point where there was just more institution building in Beirut in terms of the Armenian diaspora than there were in other places. So much so that when I meet another Beirut Armenian, I'm just constantly so impressed by their knowledge of the Armenian language. It's so deep, and they're connected to kind of contemporary Armenian literature. They're producing culture. And that comes with a little bit of maybe superiority complex and arrogance that has been noted in surveys. For example, there's like academics in the West, Armenian diaspora academics who've done research on, you know, language, learning Armenian in the diaspora, and this sense of, you know, inferiority if you don't speak Armenian perfectly, because there's always this community of Beirut Armenians who just like seems to just be so good at it that you just don't want to even try, because you know you're going to make a mistake and they might judge you. You know, it's a perception. You know, to what degree that's actually true is, you know, I don't know. But because of this history, And this reality, the cultural institutions that Beirut Armenians created have been so influential across the world, because after the Lebanese Civil War, so many Lebanese Armenians went to the US and they reestablished or established anew these same kind of institutions. And these are the most influential ones. So when we're dealing with kind of contemporary geopolitical issues within the Republic of Armenia, it's these diaspora institutions that are quite dominant. And they don't necessarily, they're not on the ground in the way that, obviously people here are. And there's a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding. I don't think anyone's ever doubted that they have the best intentions for the Republic of Armenia, but there's still this disconnect and lack of kind of perhaps skin in the game. It's not their sons going to the military, for example, getting conscripted. So, this is just kind of a simplistic, quick thing that I wanted to just touch on, because, I think it's enlightening in some way.
I also want to Karena, I see this for you, and I'm feeling it too. There is an inherent discomfort talking about this, because it is it's very weird and very a little bit scary to talk about divisions within the Armenian community, because it always feels like that's a judgment on Armenian-ness, which it really shouldn't be, and it is not.
Absolutely.
And then there's also that very strange perception of you're always in crisis, you're always trying to advocate for something, and so having a conversation with you, Joey, who you're not Armenian, about what are these divisions in the Armenian community, gets really it's sort of a scary thing to do, because it's a weird thing to converse about outwards. But it's something very real that happens when communities are split artificially by imperial histories. Because again, Armenians always have had a connection across empires. But over time, and I feel over the course of more and more divides, and also over the course of more diasporization, we've obviously been thrown even further from each other than we generally would have been. I think that's compounded. And I also think that it begins to our relationships with the respective empires that affect us most begin to have much more of an impact. So my family's my family history, we've had much more of an impact. The Russian Empire has had much more of an impact on us. So that's a real sort of fear and conversation in our household. And that's not to say that all Armenians who've been impacted by the Russian Empire view it the same way. They don't. Even within our family, it is impossible to get consensus. But it's, again, that's the dominant conversation. If you move to the West with Western Armenians who've obviously been mostly impacted by Turkish imperialism, by Pan-Turkism, by Turanism, then their perspectives are going to be very different, because that's the predominant force in their life. And that creates advocacy difficulties, but it also creates it's very bizarre, because those divisions were sort of almost not deliberately sown, but they're also a consequence of genocide and diasporization and sort of the spreading out of Armenians, and they it creates a difficulty in talking about this too, but also it creates a problem of identifying Armenians' positionality too, because there are conflicts within which we have very clear connections to, and we have really important relationships to. But because of the way that Armenian advocacy and the discussions about Armenian-ness works, and because of the sort of sense of desperation that Armenians have all the time, they don't really get discussed. So our connection or our positionality or our relationship to the Ukrainian conflict isn't really fully explored, and it's often really that conversation is very reductive. I know I've seen it. I know Karena's seen it. It's so fucking reductive. Sorry, am I allowed to swear?
Yes.
Great. It's really fucking reductive. And then the same thing of our relationship to the revolution right now in Iran. That conversation becomes very reductive too, because Armenia, the state, we have a relationship with the state of Iran, but our the possibility of our solidarity with the people of Iran gets sort of reduced beyond that. Very similar to our relationships with Kurdish liberation. And those things, like diaspora creates problems in talking about that, but like more importantly, empire creates problems in talking about that, because you're forced to make a lot of really shitty choices to survive. And that sort of precludes like it and because you're really small, because you're diasporized, it prevents like other people from having a slightly more nuanced perspective on, you know, why the state of Armenia may be making certain choices, and why that's not necessarily a reflection on like what the positionality of all Armenian people is, or why, you know, Armenian institutions in the US may be making certain choices and saying certain things, but why that's again not a full reflection on what the positionality of Armenian people as a whole is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, I don't know which episode this is going to be, but there's been like 120 plus something so far. And although I study diaspora studies is one of the stuff I do, and I focus on the Lebanese diaspora, I haven't done any episode on it yet because I honestly have no idea where to start. I'm still trying to figure out what to do and how to go about it, because it changes a lot depending on the context. And some of the main ones that those who are familiar would know would be obviously the US, like Lebanese Americans, and maybe Lebanese French to some extent as well. And then we're kind of spread out all over the rest of the world as well. And obviously in Latin America is completely different, because that's an older migration. It's why I have the Argentinian passport and I've never been there. It's passed down by, you know, my grandfather had it, you know, all of that stuff. And they're integrated, quote unquote, in that culture in a different way than in the US culture and the French culture, or what have you. What's very interesting to me is that it often gets I'm not gonna say it often gets simplified, only because, I mean, yes, that is the case, but I see lots of members of that diaspora, whether it's first gen, second, third, fourth, whatever, also participate in these simplifications, and often actually providing cover. Because if otherwise you're going to accuse, let's say, a white person of racism, and actually they are able to cite you 5 or 6 or 7 Lebanese Americans, let's say, who are actually saying the same thing that racist person is saying, it's like you're almost giving like a racial cover, you know, to that person. And this happens a lot. Like obviously we've in Syria also, it's a thing. It's a regular phenomenon. But yeah, anyway, so all of this to say that maybe one day I hope one day I'll do an episode on diaspora specifically. But for our purpose now, obviously when we started, this will go out roughly around the same time when the full-scale invasion, second invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops started. Let's get into the very complicated and messy situation, or the weeds, if you want, of how Armenians, or maybe if you don't want to generalize too much, but at least those that you have heard about, how have they kind of positioned themselves in relation to this, and how does it differ, let's say, from one diaspora to another? You know, all of this would be kind of like broad strokes and broad generalization, because it's the only way to talk about it. But let's try anyway, if you don't mind.
I'm just wading into the fire.
I'm like, oh God, here we go.
I know.
Here we go.
We're actually doing it now.
I think initially one of the things I noticed was just this exasperation on the part of Armenians around the attention that Ukraine was getting from the world, and especially the West, the sympathy and support. And I think I personally know of some people who should be, you know, naturally aligned with the Ukrainian people and supporting them, and they're rather quiet about it. Honestly, like they just haven't said anything about it. And I've heard a lot of similar sentiment from Syrians around this, although there is this kind of natural connection with Ukraine, obviously, you know, both being victims of Russian military aggression. But I think because of that international attention on the plight of Ukrainians and this kind of understanding that, you know, obviously they're being invaded by another country and they're defending themselves as anyone else would do. Whereas in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, you know, Armenians felt that the same thing was happening to Armenians there. They were being attacked by this aggressor, and there was none of that kind of sympathy. So I think there was, honestly, a lot of it was burnout, because Armenians are just, you know, dealing with existential crisis after existential crisis, that it was really hard. But I think I maybe want to give the floor to Anna now before we go into kind of what the current situation around the Russian peacekeepers and how that impacts Armenians' view of the Ukraine war. How all of that is informed.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it was like, I mean, it's in the U.S. especially the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was extremely not tinged. It was just like it was borne out by racism. And you can see that like even in the most basic structures of how like the U.S. government responded. Like the United for Ukraine program, which is it's basically the refugee program that allows Ukrainians into the U.S., is extremely efficient. Like my family has some experience with it now, even personally. So like both professionally and personally, super efficient. It works pretty quickly. It's pretty simple. That is like the biggest contrast to the godforsaken nightmare that has been getting refugees from Afghanistan into the United States. And like the just hoops that like hoops is not even like enough of a word. The absolute like hell that they have to go through that is set up by the United States in order to be able to get them here. The requirements are shifting. They've changed, what like the promises have been, so many promises have been broken. It was not planned ahead of time. And then it was a disaster when it was planned. So things like that, like pretty obviously show that, the response of the United States was, it came from a racist place. And unfortunately, what that means is that there was a lot of sympathy. Not unfortunately, what that means is that there was a lot of sympathy towards Ukrainians, which is as it should be. And like what you really don't want to do, and like what like I didn't want to do, both having like personal connection to this conflict and also just like an understanding of what the power structures at play are. Is then use that to reduce like the struggle of Ukrainians for their own rights. And that I think like is where like Karena was like describing like real burnout for Armenians, because you're seeing this like sympathy, you're seeing it tinged by racism, and we occupy a really complicated position when it comes to race. We conveniently fall in and out of like categorizations of whiteness, depending on like what's going on, and that actually can tell you a lot about what whiteness means in the US, but that's a whole other freaking thing. But that I think like made a lot of Armenians extremely wary. That, and then the fact that the state of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, positioned itself as an ally of Azerbaijan. There was like a lot of I still actually like there were a lot of like rumors that they'd sold white phosphorus. Those were debunked to some degree. I'm like pretty sure it's not true, but it's also honestly hard to like even keep track of that, because they had positioned themselves as allies of Azerbaijan. So there was a relationship between those two governments as well. And because as peoples in Eurasia and the former Soviet Union, there are unfortunately very few connections comparatively amongst ourselves, like straight across straight from Ukrainians to Armenians, as opposed to from Armenians to Russians and then to Ukrainians, or to, to those narratives, that it became really hard to have a nuanced conversation about this. And so a lot of Armenians really shut down, especially I think in the United States. And in Armenia, I don't want like Karena would be able to tell you more about this, but like from my experience, it became an even bigger freaking nightmare, because you've got Russia as the, closest thing resembling a peace guarantor, which is, I don't know, it's I guess like saying a scarecrow resembles Julia Roberts. They're just fundamentally different things, and yet that's the position that it's occupying, because that's what they've got. So you have that relationship of just like absolute frozen, like I'm not fucking touching this, like you just can't, like you don't want to touch it. And then and plus like the reality that like for a lot of Armenians, because that is the closest thing they have resembling a security guarantor, they're like, this is it, these are the only people who've done anything for us, the Russians. And so I'm not like we're not like I'm not biting the hand that feeds us, which is also really fucked up, because if you're talking about liberation, we've been forced to make, unholy alliances. And Ukrainians have also been put in a position where I wouldn't like, where unholy, like the, state alliances that have been formed are, have very little to do with like on the ground liberation is what I would say. And that's not to say that they're not related at all, because that would be also wrong. Like, we also have to own our shit. Like, we have to own our relationship to Russia in the same way that Ukrainians have to own their relationship to Azerbaijan. And I think like those are conversations that'd be really nice to have with people, because when you're actually having this conversation, it's pretty easy to like parse out that nuance and be like, well, here's my worldview. Here's the like vision of liberation that I have, and here's the vision of liberation that I'm fighting for. But you know, when you zoom out and when those conversations don't happen, and then also when you're like having those conversations via sort of imperial narratives, you're fucked, because you're always going to sort of be reduced to state action. You're going to be reduced to like the visible actions of powerful groups. And that has created a lot of trouble, I would say. And it's also, I think, created a lot of roadblocks to like liberation movements in all former Soviet Union countries, because their connections to each other are really minimal. So,
yeah. So I think the episode before this one, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be on the topic of quote-unquote multipolarity. And this is something that we've seen pop up a lot on their health sites that are social media. And the title of that episode is going to be Against Multipolar Imperialism. And so I had on Kavita Krishnan, who is an Indian feminist who was recently departed one of the communist parties of India over these issues. She was a member of the Politburo of one of them. I forgot the name, but it's one of them. Promise Lee, who's a Hong Konger in LA right now, effectively in exile, who writes for Lausanne, this very good, nice website that I contribute to from time to time. Romeo Kokriatsky, Ukrainian-American actually, writer, journalist and whatnot, who's currently also in Ukraine and who has his own podcast, Ukraine Without Hype, and myself. And so we were talking about this idea of multipolarity. And the reason why I'm bringing it up here, and for me, multipolarity, especially the way it's conceived these days, it's just equivalent to multipolar imperialism, yes, or imperial, whatever. It's just the same thing. And we've seen a number of times, I'm spacing out on which British intellectual in quotation, said this, but right after the recent invasion, like a few weeks after, whatnot, basically it's that whole thing that we need to be sensitive to Russia's demands in Ukraine because Ukraine is in Russia's backyard, right? Or Russia's sphere of influence, you know, all these things.
They're back what now?
Yeah. So these narratives are maybe not always expressed in those terms. You know, most people, I think, wouldn't use those terms if they're like sensitive enough maybe, or kind of smart about it or whatever. But the underlying logic of that is something that I think is, I mean, I haven't done a survey, but I think is relatively common. And I think of just basic non-political quote-unquote conversation I've had with family members who only check the news from time to time. And a lot of them, for example, don't know much about, I'm talking about Ukraine, Russia here, so don't know much about Ukraine and kind of just assume that Ukraine, Russia, there's some deep connection there. And it's like, as Kavita herself mentioned in the thing, it's like the position is that Ukraine is a lesser Russia, right? Mm-hmm. And Belarus gets talked about in the same way, although these days Lukashenko kind of takes over. But it's one of those things. And then when Ukrainians themselves say, no, that is not the case, it's almost like there's a bit of resentment. I don't know if that's but like, there's something like you're complicating our worldview too much now. We're used to categorizing, putting boxes on the map. The map is kind of clean, it's cute, it's nice, you know, we can color code it. This is the Russia-ish space. This is the people who are listening to this have no idea what I'm doing with my hands. And this is the
this is the danger of cameras. I think people can see my hands.
But like, you know, oh, this is, you know, ex-Ottomans and, you know, whatever, all of that stuff. Obviously, again, not always framed in those terms. I feel like the logic that of the time when it used to be framed in those terms has kind of just been recycled to accommodate our present moment, but is barely more nuanced than it was like 100 years ago, if at all. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I just ran into this. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just ran into this issue in a class I am taking. And it's it's an international law class, and there was this like conversation it was about legitimacy and the legitimacy of international law, and it was really frustrating and fascinating to see how sort of all of the suggestions were like also cycled through state apparatuses. So you had these like suggestions to make international law more legitimate, maybe more fair, and like, you know, like what, like it's a much bigger conversation, but they were all sort of, I was like taking a step back and thinking, well, all these things really do is formalize regional imperialisms. And there's unfortunately not a huge recognition of that, or a conversation around that. There have been some books that have been written that are pretty good, which I can't remember the fucking course, that have been coming out pretty recently. But still, like that identification with state apparatuses, that like filtering of everything through state apparatuses is like a huge impediment, I would say. But I think something that's like bizarre and makes the Armenian community particularly like weird in this area is that we've always transcended state apparatuses. We have always been a community beyond like borders, not to get cliche, but we have, like, it's literally always been people that are, you know, if you map Armenians, they don't follow state borders. And that creates, in a world where everything is filtered through states, in a world where all narratives are filtered through states, and conversations about identity are filtered through states, you run into really big problems. And of course, Armenians, like all people, have also taken on this like narrative structure, because I've noticed that people also filter everything through states. Joey, like you were saying, where like they've got a certain vision of the world, and the lines help. The lines help you kind of identify shit, and you like the lines, and I get that. Like, you know, they're how you see the world.
The lines are cozy.
Yeah, they're cozy, they're color-coded, they're nice. But like, it's, you know, they're helpful. Like, you need some way to see this world because it's huge, and there are people freaking everywhere. And imagine, like, you know, conceiving of it without the lines. Like, it's hard. And so, you know, Armenians themselves also filter our narratives through this like state mindset sometimes. And then we hit this wall because it's thoroughly unhelpful for us, which, you know, as we've been describing these internal advocacy problems, but it creates external advocacy issues too, because, you know, you're trying, like, for Western Armenians, I imagine it's really freaking difficult trying to explain that, like, your connection to land has not much to do with modern day the state of Armenia. That, like, your connection to land runs deeper than a state identity. And for Artsaksis, that's hard too, because, you know, which is also why Artsaksis have a struggle for statehood, because that's sort of the thing that gives you access to rights in this world. But their struggle goes beyond like a state identity. Like, it existed long before there was a struggle for state identity. That's just the flavor of how it's been construed now, because that's the thing that will give them access to most rights. But fundamentally, it's about, you know, the right to live freely without ethnic and racial oppression. But in, like, you know, it's hard to position yourself as like with your natural allies when all of you are filtering your narratives through states, because that's the thing that gives you access to political, legal, and economic rights.
I think one of the impediments to that also goes back to what you were saying earlier, Joey, in your question about Western analysts kind of oversimplifying the Ukraine conflict and kind of saying this is Russia's backyard. I think Russian studies as an institution in the West is largely to blame. And I think some academics have been starting to do some critical work around decolonizing Russian studies. And as someone with a Russian studies background, I have a master's and PhD in Russian studies. I've noticed this as well, right? Within, you know, these institutions of higher education where most of the opportunities, research opportunities, grant opportunities were centered around Russia. And most of the specialists chose Russia as their topic. And in these institutions, they also kind of subsume studies of like Central Asia, the Caucasus, even like Central East Europe. The Russia people were the ones who kind of were at the top of the hierarchy. And when you start kind of decolonizing the scholarship of the region, you actually find the Russia analyst acting like Russian imperialists in the sense that they feel threatened. Their work is threatened. Their worldview is threatened. And
their careers. And their careers, because they make a career off of commenting on
absolutely.
stuff that they didn't study.
Absolutely. And I think with more of these critical discussions, I think the Armenian struggle, as Anna was saying, would be cast in a different light, in a more nuanced light, that wouldn't see it as, for example, this is a territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, and just kind of leave it at that, like, end the conversation at that.
Fuck off.
Yeah.
Sorry.
A couple of things. One, I mean, just to maybe emphasize what you were saying and how deep that goes, I'm thinking of, I was looking it up while you were talking, like the comments of the Pope of all people, when did he say this? I don't know, some weeks ago, whatever, it doesn't matter. But he said, like, so it was while commenting on the cruelty of Russian troops in Ukraine, that quote, "The cruelest troops are perhaps those who are of Russia, but not of the Russian traditions, such as the Chechens, the Buryats, and so on."
Mm-hmm. Super cool. Super cool.
It's so specific.
Document I talked about this. Yeah, we were recording an episode on Chechnya, and we talked about this, and we were like, "What did the fucking Chechens do to you? Like, what did you?
The Buryats.
Where did what did the Pope know about Buryatia before he suddenly just like threw this freaking Molotov cocktail at them? Like, why, dude? Yeah.
But
also, what do you know about the Russian tradition? Like, what are you here commenting on the Russian tradition? Yeah, like they didn't freaking colonize and like destroy all of these people in their land. Example. My God.
But right, that example is just, for me, it just exemplifies so much just the attitude in general, and how, like, it wasn't really, I mean, it was followed by outrage in the spaces that I followed, but it wasn't this huge thing that made the news, and people were talking about it 24/7. It's like, what the fuck no, it was just a comment, and that's it. And obviously he's the Pope, so you can say stuff, stuff like that. And for me, it's very telling. And again, I just use them as an example, but in the early days of when the invasion started, I won't do too much on this because I have other episodes that focus more on Ukraine. But I sort of had the sense, and it was kind of backed up by other folks in like on Signal that I was talking to and so on. Karena knows some of them, and kind of the sense that there is a deep cynicism in the West, in Europe, specifically in my case, but also in America, towards Ukraine, Russia, and it's actually took some time, and I'm talking after the invasion, it actually took some time, and even now it's still kind of half-hearted. I'm talking at the official level, and the discourses that are being talked about, that are being used, it's almost like you get the sense at some point like Ukraine was, like, again, almost inconvenient. Like, we cannot deal with this now, almost. Like, again, I'm kind of using it as a, characterization, or caricature, but those I'm basically paraphrasing, a number of German politicians, French politicians, and whatnot, who have basically said this. Like, we have our own priority, we don't have a dog in this fight, all of that stuff. And I find that very interesting, but I'll just pin this for now, because I don't want to do too much on that. For those who don't know, I think, I actually have no idea, but I assume most folks have some general idea of Azerbaijan v. Armenia, I'm putting in quotation. Like, they have maybe some idea of the context, maybe, but I think overall, this is one of those things I understood kind of like later on, that growing up in Lebanon, I actually knew more on average than a lot of folks who did not grow up in Lebanon. And it's one of those things that's very random if you don't know anything about the context. But yeah, so what can you tell us about it, at least for the purpose of this conversation? Obviously, folks can listen to your podcast as well for more in-depth stuff, but like, what can you tell us about it just for this purpose?
I think she's so shocked that you said that.
Yeah, when Joey was like, I think people know some things, me and Karena were like, huh?
So I don't know, I try to be nice.
That was so nice. And then we're going to come in and be bitches.
Hell yeah.
No. Go for it.
God. Okay. I maybe listen to the episode 0 of the podcast, because we're going to butcher whatever explanation we start with now. But I will say, I think that to start with, most people don't know about it, which is sort of the unfortunate, not to correct you, but the unfortunate reality of like...
Correct me, it's fine.
Yeah, it's like, you're sort of... I think that this is actually because this is a frustration that I feel, and I think I think, Karena, you'll be able to relate to this too, of like being in a space where you're in conversations about international law, about conflicts, about politics, about international politics, like struggles for liberation. I talk about that stuff daily with people who are also talking about that stuff because, I don't know, their brains have rotted. But like, it's really frustrating because there is a lot to discuss in about the, you know, struggle for Armenian and Artsakh liberation that can tell you a lot about these issues. And unfortunately, anytime I want to have a conversation about it, I first have to launch into a 20-minute at minimum. Like that's like my tight 20. Like I have to launch into that explanation of what the hell is going on, what, you know, the basic actors are. Because as I mentioned in our podcast, if you Googled it, you really would have like, and somebody wrote this on CivilNet in Armenia as well. If you Googled the conflict, you would have a hard time finding out what the fuck even happened, just because the reporting is so piss poor, and because the reporting is so like riddled with both sides. You would struggle to find out who even attacked or who started a war, or like at its basic level, who are even the actors involved. It'd be impossible. So it's really hard to explain this conflict, and having conversations about it is even more difficult because you first have to launch into this explanation where you feel really fucking, you know, like bizarre because you're both advocating and explaining and like trying to be honest and also seem unbiased, which is impossible because you're like talking about the existence of your people. And also, you know what's going on. And then you know that what actually sounds unbiased is not the truth. And so you're just like, you're stuck in this like hell for 20 minutes. And then you say it and people kind of nod and go, yeah. And then you move on and it's the worst. But I think that's the setup of what happens when we want to have a deeper conversation about this. And now I'm going to I actually explain what the hell is going on because we still haven't done that.
I think I was just talking to a journalist who is covering the conflict, and he was telling me, look, for me, the conflict begins with the war in 2020, because if I start going back into the history of who occupied this land, who committed atrocities against whom, you just kind of, you get into the realm of historians, and that's kind of, he was just saying like, that's just not my job, which is fair. And it's also difficult to kind of explain all that because, you know, the person's eyes just glaze over. People just need a simple kind of good guy, bad guy, that Ukraine has actually been really, really successful in creating in people's minds, right? This like David and Goliath. This is much more complex, and I think it turns people off from really getting into the weeds. And part of it, as Anna mentioned, is the awful reporting in the mainstream media about the conflict and this kind of artificial both siding and kind of trying to maintain neutrality. But in terms of, you know, trying to maintain neutrality, they actually end up not telling the truth, because if they mention something negative about one side, they really try to find another negative thing on the other side just so they look kind of neutral and balanced. Yeah. When that thing may not be urgent, right?
Or like
because
in
bad things
scale
happen.
Or power. Or it might not be comparable in scale or power, which is something you talk about a lot right now, where it's like there, you know, you can find horrifying things on every side of a conflict, but the power scale and like what supports them, is there a state structure supporting that horror? That's something that gets obscured all of the time.
The asymmetry of the war is completely obscured with this reporting, because I don't think, you know, a lot of people are still mentally living in the 1990s when Armenia and Azerbaijan were relatively equal in terms of power and size. And that's just, you know, just not the case anymore. Azerbaijan is a petro dictatorship. They have a huge army. They're backed by Turkey, which is a NATO power. They have NATO-grade weapons. And Armenia has Russia as its security guarantor, and it's, you know, completely MIA. And just to give you an example, some of the reporters that I know have been talking to both Azerbaijani officials and Armenian officials on the ground around the blockade currently happening. And they were both kind of saying, yeah, you know, we had these issues and we tried to reach the general of the peacekeeping mission. The Russian, his name is like Volkov something. And like neither side could actually contact him. They didn't know where he was. Like he just wasn't picking up the phone. So literally MIA, you know what I mean? And I think one of the things that I noticed when the 2020 war was still going on and after, in the aftermath, I have to say, just kind of very briefly, was in many ways almost more traumatic than the war itself, because I mean, for Armenians in any case, because, you know, we lost, and then we were subjected to the steady stream of kind of, you know, torture porn, war porn, videos of Azerbaijani servicemen kind of torturing, mutilating, executing Armenian civilians and POWs. And I remember at the time, I was just kind of on Twitter thinking, oh my God, only Armenians are talking about this. Like literally no one cares. No one else is saying anything. And what was worse was that a lot of the journalists who focus on the region, so they're based in the region or work for outlets that, specifically cover the region, and analysts as well, were kind of condescendingly talking down to Armenians, saying things, essentially saying you're overreacting, you're being really emotional. And it was in that moment that I realized, for example, my word, even as someone with a PhD and expertise in the region, working on political science and politics and security in the region, was somehow undervalued or devalued to the point where my analysis was worth less than this old white British journalist, really like travel writer, right? Thomas DeWall, I'll name him, who doesn't even have a master's degree. I mean, he has his undergrad was in Greek, like ancient Greek. And
close enough,
right? And it was just really interesting because a lot of the Armenian scholars online were kind of giving these really fact-based kind of debunks of his points, kind of saying, well, this isn't true because here's evidence, and these people were treated as like just these emotional Armenians. You're so tribal and incapable of objectivity because you have this emotional connection to the conflict. And it reminded me of this book, and I absolutely recommend this to your listeners. It's called The Politics of Exile, written by a scholar named Elizabeth Dauphiné, who is a scholar of the Bosnian War. And it's an autoethnography, which is an amazing genre in and of itself. I mean, it's written like a novel, but it's a scholarly work. And in it, she describes giving a talk about the Bosnian War and being challenged by a Bosnian man in the audience who was there for everything. And it's just, the story develops around their budding relationship, their friendship, and it kind of invites the reader to question whether you can look at something like conflict, war, death in an objective way, whether objectivity is even possible, let alone, this idea that objectivity is even a thing that exists, as if, this British man's worldview and whole life hasn't, impacted how he sees this conflict. Obviously not. But I think a lot of things for me personally kind of fell into place. I was like, okay. So this is what my voice is worth. Right. And also I just wanted to go back and say, it's not because I have a PhD that I'm like, my voice is somehow more valuable than someone else's, but I think it means something. And it means, the fact that I've worked on the region and I'm here, I think does count for something. But it was really this inherent racism. Huh?
Well, also, you were talking about facts, right? Like, that was what was crazy, is that you would bring up facts and you would get responses to your emotions, which, like, hadn't even really entered the conversation at that point until somebody was like, you're being emotional. You're like, okay, but what about the litany of, fact-based information that I just gave you?
Yeah. We wrote so this Tom DeWall wrote, this is just to give you an example of the sort of general attitude. He'd written this article in Carnegie about after the US government recognized the Armenian genocide. And in this article, he basically says things like Armenians wear genocide like a badge of honor, which was obviously like amazing. He retracted that bit, but this article was filled with other factual inaccuracies and misrepresentations. And a group of scholars, including myself, wrote a letter to Carnegie kind of asking for the chance for a rebuttal. And the head of the section that Tom DeWall works for, this woman named Rosa Balfour, responded to us. She decided to double down, defend him. But the opening of her email was just so illustrative. She said, I know this is an emotional topic, and which is why I thank you for approaching me in a civilized manner.
Yeah, I've been on the receiving end of that a lot of times.
Yeah, like you're a group of savages approaching her, and she's like, "Wow, thank you for being so civil."
Yeah, it's so nice of you.
Yeah.
So this story is public, and I'll mention it also as an example, and then I'll make my point. But when I was still at the University of Edinburgh, like 4 years ago now, sorry, 2023, I had this interaction with a pretty notorious conspiracy theorist called Tim Hayward, who has kind of been in the news a bunch of time when it comes to Syria, because he was a professor there at the university, and I think still is. And he ended up reporting me to the department because I called him a fraud on Twitter, which he is. I'm repeating it. But then so because of that, so I went to the head of my department, who didn't know anything of what was going on. And the guy himself was like nice. He didn't say anything bad to me personally, but it was very clear that from that interaction that the actual content of what was happening just did not matter. It didn't matter what kind of impact he was having, what kind of damages he was doing, all of that stuff. The disinformation that was either directly sponsored or indirectly sponsored by the Russian state, which now probably is a bit more well known. Although even then, I mean, it was after Brexit and after Trump, so it was kind of in the news, but lots of folks did not want to really think about it. But that's a different thing. So because of that, it kind of brought home, and like long story short, I did this episode with Artsakh, Syrian journalist in France, currently an exile in France. I'm going to say last year, although it could be 2 years ago, but what is time really? And he had written this piece for New Lines called Why I No Longer Write About Syria, or Why I'm going to Stop, something like that. And so we talked about that as well. And he had an episode on their podcast as well, which was pretty good. So we talked about that, and shortly after the conversation, actually, I had kind of made a decision to effectively join that sentiment when it comes to Lebanon. Now, it doesn't mean that I stopped writing about Lebanon, but it's more that, and Syria for that matter, because I used to write, still do, but much more write about Syria quite a lot. But I wanted to kind of take a break and try and get a sense of what actual impact can I have. Because a lot of the time if I was being talked to at all, it was kind of just for like, a quote here and there, but that's often presented in a piece that's kind of like, again, both-sidism, right? And when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Lebanon, I can sort of understand because there's lots of different actors and whatnot. When it comes to Syria, there is a state and there is a non-state. Now, I'm talking not about the north, but for most of Syria's recent history since the Arab Spring, the overwhelming majority of the atrocities were committed by the Assad regime, and that's just a documented fact. And so if you kind of ignore that fact, you don't want to think about that fact, it's much easier to kind of focus on specific rebel groups and, jihadi extremists and whatnot, and basically say that this is the other side. You have the Assadists on one side, we don't really like them, but hey, we can talk to them and he speaks English. And you have the other side that are kind of, they have funky beards, kind of like mine, and that sort of thing. And we cannot take them seriously, obviously. And fuck it, I don't care about them. They're not nice people. But the what you mentioned before, the disproportion in power, that's one of the things that even irritates me. And, Israel-Palestine is even more pronounced often on that when it comes to the West anyway, that the term conflict often kind of simplifies things. I understand that literally it is accurate, like in the sense of how you're describing something, this is a conflict, Israel-Palestine. But it kind of sort of implies that, for example, the Palestinians have an army, a navy, an airport, basic stuff to kind of fight back, let's say, or to whatnot. And obviously that's not the case. So if you ignore that, it kind of becomes, okay, I'm going to give a very ridiculous example and then I'll stop my point. But it reminds me, there's an episode of Gilmore Girls, and yes, I went there.
Yes! Oh, I'm so happy you said that.
I need to get out of here.
But
oh God, okay, please.
No, it's okay. There's an episode of Gilmore Girls where they're at university. So there's Rory and Paris, her friend, and they're in the class on Middle East something. I don't know what the fuck they were talking about, but they were on there, and they were talking about Israel-Palestine.
I remember this so clearly.
People can look it up. It's on YouTube. Just write Gilmore Girls, Israel-Palestine. But so the arguments were. I think Rory is the one who made the quote-unquote nuanced argument. I don't remember what it was, which was still trash, but it was something like let me remember. It was something like, there are different reasons and whatever. She was trying to be nuanced. And then the other person, Paris in this case, said, actually, it's much simple. You have the Jews are descendant of whatever, and the Arabs are descendant of whatever, and they've been fighting for thousands of years, or whatever it is that she said. And what's amazing is that the professor, again, a fancy Yale professor, whatever, says, that's interesting. There was no, like, basically that entire word, and something I got very used to, obviously watching, especially American TV or British TV or whatnot, that they don't, like, we don't really exist. Like, it's not, there aren't real people there. It's just headlines. It's just kind of, again, those cute corners on the map, very simplistic ancestries, for thousands of years, the Arabs and the Jews have been fighting. No, they have, all of that stuff.
I found the quote.
I'll stop at that, but like, it's everywhere. Yeah, go for it.
I found the quote. Paris says, when you boil it down, isn't the whole Israeli-Palestinian problem a case of sibling rivalry? And the professor just goes, follow up? And she says, the Old Testament, it's all there. Israelis are descendants of Abraham and Sarah. Arabs are descendants of Abraham and his maid Hagar. So Israelis and Arabs both have the same dad and both want the great nation God promised Abraham. They might as well be fighting over who gets the TV remote.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's so good. But it's also, yes, sorry, I'm so glad you said that though, because I actually think it really matters how, like, Israel-Palestine happens to have entered, like, the public lexicon in this way. And so you get to really see, like, what is, because people casually reference it. So it's in the casual references that you get to see, like, what is really, like, what's the essence of what people are boiling.
Yeah, because they don't have you in mind, right? Yeah. They're not talking to you. And so because they're not talking to you, and this is the whole James Baldwin thing that I always steal, like, because they're not talking to you, you are actually, you can pay more attention to what they're saying than their audience, or for that matter, them, for what they are actually saying. You can, because they're not talking to you, so they're not bothering to contextualize or to be sensitive or to hide what they're saying or whatnot. They're just saying it.
Yeah.
And so that's very interesting. And it's everywhere in pop culture. It's everywhere. I do cultural studies, so it's something I watch TV and I say that I study. Basically, that's what I do. But it's something that
we
it's
watching
very
Gilmore Girls.
This is for science.
Honestly, no, but like, that's very, because the thing is, like, about Armenians, it's what's kind of difficult is that Armenians we very rarely enter the public conversation. And so this is like a really dehumanizing effort where, like, as Armenians, you're constantly fighting to enter the public conversation. You're constantly fighting to, like, get that, like, abstracted cultural reference. And then you do enter the cultural conversation on occasion, and you're like,
or it's like some mafia boss shit, like,
yeah,
those
like,
Armenians.
Also, like, I also have a bone to pick with, this is a whole other thing, but like, I've recently seen, like, some representations of Armenians on television, and they're all really fucked up. Like, I'm always just like,
it's all mafia shit, right?
Like, it's either mafia shit or it's like really, frankly, offensive, like, portrayals of Armenians in LA.
Oh, God.
And, like, listen, we get to make fun of our diasporas. Yeah. You don't get to make fun of our diasporas. Like, no. But, like, that's also, like, I joke, but also, like, they're bizarre. Like, they're truly, like, I imagine, like, if you did this to any other group now, like, even other white coded groups, I'm like, it would just be bizarre. Like, it's just bizarre. Mm-hmm. Anyways, yes, it is, like, you do see, like, this, like, reduction of, like, the conversation and, like, what's appropriate and what isn't. And I was just thinking, so right now, we'd be kind of remiss not to mention this, but there's, like, a group of Azerbaijani eco-activists, eco-fascists, eco-nothing. I don't know or care what they are. They've blocked the only road leading from Armenia to the Republic of Artsakh. And this blockade is entering I really am bad at math. It's the 37th or 38th day, depending on if you include it's entering, like, over a month now.
And today is January 18th for the record.
Yeah. So, yes, that's a good point. Right now, it's entering its 38th. Its 38th day, but depending on when this episode comes out, hopefully it'll be over. But that's not necessarily something that can realistically be hoped for. And so, what that means is right now they're rationing food in the Republic of Artsakh, and I think this has, interestingly enough, forced coverage to become a little bit more honest. Like, I see coverage because it's really hard to. You can't
both sides this one.
Yeah, like, you can't be like, I don't really know who's blocking the road, like, which I swear to God I thought they were gonna do.
It fits in the whole like humanitarian.
Even denying that the road is blocked, by the way, you know that, right? They show the two Red Cross cars that go through, and they're like, "See,"
which is like really interesting because it's like, like there's this. It's so bizarre because there's like this like there are Red Cross cars going through. Anywhere else where you have the Red Cross with their freaking flag flying, like, please don't shoot us, we're the Red Cross, like driving through, you'd be like, oh, that's a humanitarian crisis. And they're like calling this as a blockade as a joke. And I'm like, all right, like I don't know what to tell you. If someone's airlifting supplies in or like driving supplies in because you can't simply get them by the normal routes of trade, that's a blockade. Especially since like it's, limited supplies and things like that. And actually, I think it was just yesterday that Karena, you're probably going to want to comment on this, but just yesterday, a group of children that was separated from their parents. They were in Armenia, and when the blockade came down, I guess, and they were separated from their families, and they had been separated for this entire time. Yesterday, they were returned to the Republic of Artsakh and reunited with their families with the with the help of humanitarian intervention. But even in the process of returning those children to the Republic of Artsakh, they were like the bus that was driving them from Armenia to Artsakh was boarded by, I think, masked Azerbaijani
agents.
I don't I don't know if they're working for someone else.
Whether they were the eco activists in quotations or
I don't know if it's motivated by personal vitriol or professional vitriol. I don't really care. But they boarded this bus and one student fainted. Like they were just like terrorizing these kids. And I'm giving these illustrations mainly to like describe that like, so the reason I say this is because I was looking up articles to kind of like see what the news coverage about it was like. And even still, like even as you're describing a blockade, food, like there's no food in the supermarkets right now. They're rationing pasta and sugar. Even with that happening, you had Thomas Duvall saying something like, well, both sides have definitely been the aggressor in the past. Now for sure, Azerbaijan is the aggressor. This is what had to happen for Azerbaijan to be named as the aggressor. And yet still, like, there's this, like, both sides have been, like, I can't, at this point, can't really imagine that being said in these same media sources about, like Ukraine, for example, because in a conflict, they're like, people fight back. But it's this like, it's again, that story of like how the words of like really particular non-stakeholders have become very, like have had outsized importance. And it's very strange.
They were on the ground, not on the ground, but because they were some of the first Western analysts to look at the region, they just hold this kind of unassailable position as the authority on the conflict, even though he hasn't been here in years. He doesn't speak any local languages aside from Russian.
Which is a stretch to call that a local language. Frankly, in the modern era, it's really a stretch to call that a local language in Armenia.
Anna, did I tell you I met those kids?
You did. I wasn't sure if you wanted to share that, but
I did, and I recognized a couple of them in the video.
Yeah.
So just for your listeners, Joey, these kids, they were from the ages of 13, 14 to 17, 18. They were young musicians from Artsakh who had traveled as a group to Armenia with a chaperone to watch or attend the Junior Eurovision, which was in December. And then when they were trying to go back, the road was closed. It was blockaded, and they've been stuck in Armenia ever since. And they were staying at a hotel where I was staying. And I'd gone down to the restaurant to have dinner, and the woman working there said, can I take this extra chair? And I was like, sure. And she says, it's for the kids. And I was like, what kids? And she said, oh, the kids from Artsakh. And I just kind of like looked over and I saw them soon. I was like, oh my God. It just slowly dawned on me like who they were, because I'd heard of them. And in the evenings, they were just getting together in the lobby and just playing their instruments. They were singing, just, hanging out on their phones, just, no structure to their day, just kind of, it was really sad seeing them. But, I think, I don't know, for what it's worth, I don't know, I don't want to be a kind of simplifying what's happening here, but it seems like maybe this is helpful for your listeners as well, Joey, that Azerbaijan kind of wants to create a sort of Gaza situation with this siege and kind of keeping these people under pressure like this long term.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend who was recently in Palestine. She brought me back this awesome keffiyeh. It's in the shot. But she she was like visiting her family's home in Palestine, and she was saying how Israeli soldiers were going around making them take down all the Palestinian flags.
Yeah.
And she was like, this time it's because it was Hanukkah or for some other like fucking reason that they were coming up with. And she felt like, it felt humiliating to her. And I was just thinking, this is very familiar because that's what Azerbaijanis would do to vehicles traveling through Artsakh. They would make them take down the Artsakh flags. They would scratch them off of cars. And it's that like, and the reason I mentioned like the children kind of being harassed as they were entering, their homes is this was a humanitarian effort. It really would have been absolutely zero loss to Azerbaijan to just let it happen. In fact, it probably would have helped them with PR. And yet I think the goal of, there's like one way to look at it, which is to say they just hate us so much that they had to they had to take this opportunity to terrorize those kids, which is entirely possible. But I think there's also another like a little bit more a different explanation, which is that the priority is actually not on the outer world. The outer world has sort of made its opinion heard. The priority is on internal terror. It is on internal humiliation because that's what kind of keeps makes people leave. And that's like, that is enough of a priority that it's worth whatever results come out from that, like whatever news story comes out from that about you terrorizing these children, about you treating them this way during a humanitarian effort to like reunite them with their families in the middle of a blockade. So it's not even like they're not being airlifted out of Artsakh. They're being I keep saying airlifted. They're not being airlifted at all. They're not being like transported out of the danger zone. They want to get back with their families who are in the danger zone. And still, like, I think the priority is on that kind of like terror and humiliation, which gets obscured with pretty much all the coverage of this, even as like you see, even as you see slightly better reporting coming out of it. So that's what's going on in Artsakh right now, which is also why like it's weird to come here and have this conversation about like diaspora and identity, about what all of this means when like again we're like you're trying to unpack all of this stuff while also like advocating for the sort of very real and immediate issue. And but you can't not do it. You have to unpack all that shit because it's the stuff that's impeding you from being able to advocate properly for the very real issue. So I don't know. That's where we're stuck.
Yeah, I mean, one stupid thought I had while you were talking is like, wow, this is gonna be complicated to pick up a title for this episode.
Yeah.
It's not one thing.
That is why I only choose stupid titles for our. Every time I say that title, I just be like, where did we even fucking get that?
It should be like Armenians : it's complicated.
Yeah,
but, like the what you mentioned, like for me. I was gonna say like cruelty is sometimes the point. At least it's part of the arsenal being used. It's not like a side effect. It's just like rogue. There is this tendency, I think, due to the quote unquote objectivity aim of a lot of reporting, a lot of even academia on this, that if you say something very straightforward, they did this and we know they did this because it was literally filmed and they said they did this, for example, then this, you risk becoming quote unquote biased or whatnot, which for one, it implies that people are not biased in general. It implies that there is such a thing as neutrality. Like, Karena, you mentioned like, I understand that person who said, I understand this is an emotional time for you and whatnot. And sometimes the response in my mind is that, why is this not an emotional time for you? It's that kind of thing, because at the end of the day, this is what I meant beginning at the time, that yes, of course, with Ukraine, not with Ukraine, but with a lot of the Western response towards the Russian invasion to Ukraine, there is quite a lot to critique and criticize there. But part of me was also just kind of wondering whether this whole privileged status, and I'm putting this in quotation because, a refugee is not privileged by definition, but the sense of like being paid more attention to, let's say, I kind of wondered from the beginning whether this was going to be a long-lasting thing anyway, because it's not that long ago and it's still ongoing. You mentioned the caricature of the Armenian mafia and whatever. Like in Britain, for example, in the UK, in the run-up to Brexit and after Brexit, like they were obsessed even more so with like Poles and Romanians and whatnot than they were, with us, with my people. They were more like obsessed with that. They would talk about it much more. Like, so for me, this is where it kind of all boils down to in some sense, is that there is a tendency which is still common. And okay, I'll give you a quick example that when the recent violence, uptick in violence, and that's always complicated to mention
the language
in the context of Israel-Palestine, is, I think last year, I mean, lots of folks, Palestinians, others, were kind of surprised, pleasantly so, to some extent, that Palestinians were being platformed in like Palestinians were actually being talked to in like on CNN and stuff like that. And this is 70 plus years at this point, and it's so uncommon that this was genuinely part of the topic of conversation, like the times are changing and whatnot. And sure, maybe they are, or whatever that means, but of course there is the question of like, why did it take so long, and what does it say about the coverage itself? If the fundamental framework was about conflict, quote unquote, then this is, you're going to assume that there are both sides, and obviously Israelis are more used to, or Israeli government agents especially, or officials or journalists or whatever, are more used to speaking to Westerners than Palestinians are, or more heard in any case. There are all of these elements, and that's why, like, I was joking about Gilmore Girls or whatever, but these things really enter the discourse, the way people consume them. When I would watch some of these series with like a bunch of friends, I would be the annoying one pointing out how problematic this is, but like it becomes
we're so
like
much
you
fun at
have to. I have a signal group called Party Poopers United. Just
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please continue.
No. But because of that, because of all of that, like it's very difficult for me to explain this positionality, to use that dreaded word again, of how my experience growing up in Lebanon really differed from, let's say, if a person who grew up in France or whatnot. And on some level, that's normal, right? You grow up in different places, you have different experiences. But what's kind of obviously specific about the context of Lebanon, and since the Arab Spring, the region more broadly, since 2003, arguably the region more broadly, is that we have already been talked about a lot, in the sense that in the media, in movies, in series, in all of that stuff. And for me, it's kind of bizarre. It was a bizarre experience. Like, I do cinema studies, so I would watch a lot of these films that portray Lebanon, sometimes made by Lebanese, but often not. And I have no idea where this place is. I don't know. I don't recognize anything. There's nothing. And I'm not even talking stuff, this is set in the 80s during the war. No, recent stuff. Like, just, there was, what was it? Homeland, I think. I don't remember which one of those American TV series.
Those are always the biggest offenders, yeah.
Yes, but they were filming supposedly Beirut, and it was actually Haifa. And there were like Hebrew signs, it was supposed to be contemporary. It's like, just stuff like that, it gets taken for granted a lot how wrong how easy it is to just include basic facts and what it says when you really don't feel like you have any need to, because your audience don't know about it anyway, or you assume they don't know about it, and in any case your audience are not the peoples you're talking about, right? So these things are very embedded in how discourse is often how discourse often happens. And it percolates, right? Like, it's embedded in everything from cultural study, from the media to as in news media, to cinema, movies, books, whatnot, and obviously to politics. It was a bizarre experience growing up in Lebanon and kind of consuming a lot of Western media. Like, that's basically how I learned English, and then it became my working language and all of that stuff. It's a non-uncommon story in a lot of circles, but not completely connecting the dots, for a long time between what they were talking about when they were talking about quote unquote us, and in who the audience was and whatnot. Like, there was a disconnect, and this James Baldwin talks about it. And obviously, in the case of African Americans, it's I think arguably a much more violent and ongoing thing, in which he has this example where he would watch a movie when he was a young kid, and he didn't know that he was supposed to be the black person in that movie. He didn't have a knowledge of himself, an awareness of himself as the black person, right, quote unquote, and obviously the N-word at the time as well. So he didn't have that conception of himself, and it was given to him. It was imposed on him in many ways, and he had to adapt. He had to, in some sense, he integrated it. He internalized it, and then there's the entire process of deconstructing all of that, which he talks about quite eloquently. And in my case, like, there's been kind of a similar trajectory in which I can't, now it sounds bizarre when I say it out loud, but growing up I didn't quite even associate myself with, let's say, the Muslim or the Muslim Arabs who were on TV, because we grew up Lebanese Christians in a middle class household in Lebanon, and I didn't quite know that the people who were having these portrayals didn't know what the nuanced differences between the different groups of Arabs or whatnot were anyway. And of course, we can think of the example post 9/11 of like Sikhs being attacked in Canada or the US and stuff like that, right? Because it's racialized, and when it's racialized, it's obviously not, it's not quote unquote logical. But so it's been a bizarre experience. I give this example a number of times that I genuinely did not know that Muslims use the word Allah. I just did not know this, because everyone in my area when I was growing up was a Christian, and Allah is just the Arabic word for God, and so we would say Allah and we meant Jesus. And so it was a very, very weird out of body experience. That's how I can describe it. And it took some time, like I'm 31 now, it took some time to kind of understand that there is a person who is me, like there is my experience, and there is all of those caricatures, right? There's all of those ideas and whatnot. And actually understanding those stereotypes, cliches, racist portrayals, assumptions, all of that stuff can be empowering, because in some sense I know how to navigate it in some ways, in a way that doesn't necessarily just harm me, if that makes sense. I always reject it. When I say navigating, I don't mean I accept it, but it says I know what's coming. And because if I know what's coming, I'm able to sort of adapt accordingly. And so this, rather awkwardly, I wanted to segue to, we did warn listeners at the beginning that we have too many things to talk about. So that's, honestly, if you're still listening, that's on you.
This is your problem.
This is your problem. Like, that's not my problem. But the idea of whiteness, quote unquote, and usually we mean that in the context of the US. I have some insights in the context of France as well when it comes to Lebanon and Lebanese Christians specifically. But let's focus on what we sort of know, because I don't want to, it's not going to be an entire like an America thing or talking specifically only about like US race relations, for lack of a better term or whatever. But I'm very interested in this idea because obviously now I think it's becoming more and more known that the idea of whiteness, the idea of race, those are social constructs, but it's still taken for granted, obviously, in many circles, if not most circles. And so it surprises people when they find out, for example, that actually historically and in many ways to this day, Arab Americans were categorized as white. Because this goes back to a case, infamous case that people can look up like 100-something years ago, of a Syrian man, I believe, I don't remember or a Syrian Christian who wanted to argue that he was white because of whatever. So because this obviously continued to this day and whatnot, and while in media portrayal and politics, obviously the average Arab American is still stigmatized and whatnot, but there is this very complicated history that, for example, if you don't know it, you may not quite understand why there are like Lebanese Christian Americans, especially, this was especially the case after 9/11, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, who were positioning themselves as far right, basically. You know, they were, to use that example I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, they were the ones who were kind of being the useful other to the racists and to the white supremacists and to the Islamophobes, because they would say, you hate Muslims, I'm from Lebanon, they killed us all, that sort of thing. And this becomes very complicated, obviously, when you then broaden the conversation and you want to start including all of the diasporas and all of the experiences and all of that stuff and the different things that can be said, but maybe the person who's saying them doesn't have the same intention or doesn't mean it in the same way, all of that stuff. So can we talk a bit, to the extent that we feel it's useful to the overall thread of this conversation already, talk about how these social constructs have affected maybe your lives or lives of folks that you know, and what has sort of been your journey or your process to untangle that very fun mess?
For me specifically, because I'm also from Iran, my family's from Iran, I had to deal with very specific anti-Iranian sentiment, especially after the hostage crisis in 79 or whenever it was. So growing up, I felt stigmatized for that reason. And I think for that reason, a lot of Americans, at least in Southern California, where I grew up, saw Armenians as Middle Eastern, because a lot of us at the time were new immigrants from Iran, from Lebanon, specifically. And then, later waves came from Armenia, and it kind of changed the idea. So I did grow up. And I think, there's something to be said about being a visible minority. we're big enough in numbers in Southern California where people kind of know who we are, but that's kind of a negative. There's like a negative association around us. Whereas in France, for example, that's not the case. It's quite positive. But then, when I was living in the UK, people kind of didn't know who Armenians were, and they were like, "Oh, you're Romanian," kind of thing. But I think one of the weird I don't know if this is like directly related to what you're saying, but my brain kind of went in this direction. There have been so many instances on Twitter. I don't know if either of you have ever seen it, but with people kind of starting these really fraught conversations on Twitter, very one-sided, about whether Armenians are white or not. And they always hold up Kim Kardashian as the example and kind of show her like white mom and like how anti-Black she's been. And it's just kind of broad strokes, like paint all Armenians as like, they're not POC kind of thing. And just kind of telling us who we are and like speaking over our experiences, which are nuanced. I'm not going to say we're POC and that's it. It's much more complicated than that. I don't understand. Maybe Anna can speak a little bit to this. Like, I just fucking don't understand these conversations. And every time I see a new one, I'm just like, oh my God, I'm just going to shut this down. I'm going to like close my laptop. I'm going to go touch grass because this isn't healthy.
Yeah. This might be the reason. I mean, it's not, but like it is the reason I stopped using Twitter. It's just like, I hate this. We really picked like we really picked a number of things to address today, didn't we?
Welcome to the fire these times.
I know. Truly, like
now I get the title.
Yeah, I feel personally burned. I feel like I am being attacked. This is hell. No, I'm not kidding. I'm kidding, Joe. Sorry.
No, I know, no worries.
Well, it's also because these are fraught conversations within the Armenian community. So sometimes I think like I could give less of a shit what like a bunch of Americans and white people probably would have to say about what I say here, but like it matters to me what how respected Armenians and dignified they feel about the ways in which like we talk about each other. So, anyways, but here goes nothing. So the case that you were talking about was Dow versus the United States. That was the case of a Syrian immigrant who wanted to basically be able to be naturalized as. And in order to be naturalized, he had to be classed as a white person. And he was given the right to be classed as a white person. I wish I had read this case beforehand because I would be able to tell you a little bit about the reasoning of that case. Because
there's a very good episode of the Ottoman history podcast. I'll try and find it that talks about that specific thing. But yeah.
Well, so there's a series of these cases, right? So there's one for Armenians too, which is the United States versus Cartosian, and that was a district court case in Oregon. There was also another one in Massachusetts. I can't remember the exact name of it. And all of these cases sort of gave Syrians and Armenians the ability to be classed as white. And I think we have to remember that the reason that being classed as white matters is because this was like during the era of Jim Crow. It was sort of like at the beginning to middle of like the Jim Crow era, I would say. It was, when Jim Crow was like lynchings were extremely common of Black people across the United States. The KKK was.
Yeah, I mean, it was literally a matter of survival to be classed as white in some cases. Like you would want to be classed as that so that someone doesn't knock at your door. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say that because I would say that Jim Crow was always targeting Black people and Black people as seen and perceived by white people in the United States. And so I don't think anybody was going to, I'm not going to bury myself to the statement because I'm sure there are instances that you can find, but finding a cross burning in front of your house is really a Black experience. Being targeted by the KKK, experiencing lynchings is a Black experience. And that's not to say that it's never happened to anybody else before somebody fucking whatever, but that divorcing that.
That's fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. It's from Blackness in the United States isn't fair and it's wrong. But the other thing is housing. So, Roosevelt's New Deal, when it comes to housing and the history of redlining in various cities across the United States, that was tied to your ability to be classed as white. Being naturalized was tied to your ability to be classed as white. And I want to contrast those two cases to the case of US v. Bhagat Singh Thind, who was an Indian Sikh man
who also wanted to be classed as white in order to be in order to attain naturalized citizenship in the United States. He was not given that right, his argument was also interesting because he argued that he was Aryan, basically using elements of the Aryan invasion theory. And I want to talk not about like the decisions of those cases because the decisions tell us a little bit about whiteness as it was conceived too, namely that Christianity started playing a bigger and bigger role in whiteness, and that's I think something Armenians have exploited over history, as have Syrian Christians and things like that. But our arguments also play a role because there's something in common with both, with what we all argued, which is that all of these groups argued that we were white. We argued for various reasons, like using various like touchstones of whiteness to say that we were white. And I like to talk about that because it's something I think Armenians don't acknowledge we don't acknowledge enough, I feel like, which is that by saying that we're white, by saying that, because we're Christian, we have proximity to whiteness, Bhagat Singh Tin saying that because of the Aryan invasion theory, he's, a member of the Caucasian race, we were validating and participating in Jim Crow. So even those arguments, and I understand that, it was a matter of survival. It was really trying to, it was a matter of trying to access basic resources in the United States, because when you do something as violent and sort of all-encompassing as when you create a system like Jim Crow, it will touch everything. And you end up in these weird situations where you have to decide, well, is someone white to get housing? So it's violent. But we are participating in it by arguing not that Jim Crow is wrong, because there's a universe in which you see something else. And there's a universe in which you see Armenians saying, you weaponizing their proximity to whiteness to attack Jim Crow instead of validate it. You can see that that's a version of history that, you can invent in your mind as well, where we see, what we look like, we see our Christianity, whatever. We take those touchstones of whiteness and we use them to attack whiteness as a concept, to attack Jim Crow. That's really not systematically where Armenian history and the history of Armenian Americans went. So Armenians got access to legalized whiteness. That's not to negate the experience of actual whiteness, because that's not really something that you can gain access to as easily.
I'm thinking of a very cringe thing that happened during the George Floyd protests. Obviously, there was this global element to it, right? There were reverberations of it everywhere in the world. And, probably most of it was fine. I didn't do an extensive study. But there was one in Lebanon. There's a few in Lebanon, actually. One problematic, one not problematic. And the reason why one was problematic is that the banner that they had was Lebanese Lives Matter, right? The whole Black Lives Matter, Lebanese Lives Matter.
Was a common, yeah.
Yeah, and the very problematic thing about that aspect is that Lebanon has a deeply racialized system under the kafala system, which I've talked about a number of times on this podcast as well. And the victims of that system are not quote unquote Lebanese, as it's as that sign was trying to the people that sign had in mind. Well, you had another protest that sort of I don't know if they used the term Black Lives Matter, but they were kind of in that spirit, and it was spearheaded by Ethiopian migrant workers and other racialized migrant workers in Lebanon, most of them from Asia and Africa, that they had a resonance with that slogan, right, with that principle, and for very obvious reasons. They are the ones who are racialized in the Lebanese context, and so there are ways in which these and it's sometimes or often is the case because of the kind of globalization of the English language and obviously the role of America and pop culture, all of that stuff. It tends to be that something happens in America and it kind of launches a global impact. That's just kind of common after effect in some sense, but it obviously then stuff gets lost in translation and not every all of that stuff. So all of this to say, so I don't get lost in kind of the weeds of this of my own very messy mind right now, is that Lebanon, and the reason why I said positionality at the beginning, Lebanon has this very bizarre, and I don't know if that's the right term, but very unique, although everything is unique, but for me, a very specific, let's say, positionality in its own history. And as someone who is Lebanese, but not just Lebanese, but from a quote-unquote Lebanese Christian family, from a certain class, from a certain area, from a certain whatever, all of those stuff allowed me in a bizarre, I'm using that term too often, sorry, and it allowed me to have access in some sense to the narrative or the dominant discourses when it came to Islamophobia, when it came to racism, because in some sense they were often the people who were using those the people who were participating in that discourse were using folks like me in mind, right? Like I'm thinking, I wrote an article for Al Jazeera on the Meloni phenomenon, the far right in Italy, and she had, I don't know if she still does, but she has the Noon, the N letter on her Twitter profile, and that's a reference to the persecution of Christians by ISIS. And so from her perspective, Christians in the Middle East need to just be protected, and it's an Islam versus Christianity thing and whatnot, which tends to obviously participate in Islamophobic discourse, but also erase the Christians of Iraq, of Syria, of Lebanon, and whatnot, who are complicated, who have just different politics. Some are right wing, some are fascist, some are lefty, some are don't know. It's a complicated situation, and when we don't want, and I'm saying when folks don't want to accept the complexity of situation, you have all of these consequences that happen that usually affect the people being talked about, or and saying it in a different, the people being erased in that discourse, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking that those Christians in the Middle East are also targeted by the racialization of Islam, because the racialization of Muslim identity has created it's sort of it then becomes geographic, and so policies targeting those same policies that far right people advocate for then end up targeting extremely unfairly also religious minorities in the Middle East, which is just a byproduct from exactly which is a byproduct of stupid decisions. It's a byproduct of stupid racist decisions. But something that Armenian identity only ever comes up on Twitter or anywhere when one of two things happens, is what I've noticed, is when an Armenian has done something super fucking racist and all Armenians want to use our want to sort of use status as oppression as a way to defer from that, or when Armenians are being murdered and people want to use our status, our proximity to whiteness, to ignore that.
Yep.
Both are exhausting. I hate both, and I would like to put my head through a wall anytime any of them come up. But it's it's very frustrating because as Armenians, we do occupy a lot of proximity to whiteness, and we have weaponized that proximity to whiteness to almost no benefit to ourselves, but we've desperately clung to it to try and get attention to Armenia. And it hasn't been particularly effective, because at the end of the day, they're not going to care about you because you you really try to become as close to them as possible.
It's just quickly, it's I think it was Syrian Christian American, I don't remember, or Iraqi Christian American, but he voted for Trump and then was kind of shocked that he was on the receiving end of the deportation.
I never saw liberals leave my face.
yeah, but it's it's a complicated conversation, but also why we started this by talking about diaspora, because Armenians occupy a certain space in the United States, and that is everything in the United States is underpinned by the history of chattel slavery and Jim Crow. So to sort of give ourselves a status in the United, and I do not have an answer to, are we white, are we POC? I don't fucking care. The fact that we fall in and out of those categories should tell you a lot about what whiteness means in the United States. Because we are at the edges of it, and our inclusion and exclusion from them can tell you more about the system than anything about ourselves, because whatever. But we occupy proximity to whiteness in the United States. Globally, though, that doesn't, what does that fucking do for the Armenians in Artsakh who are living under a blockade right now, right? That proximity to whiteness is getting them nowhere. It's not helping them in any sense, because it doesn't exist in that context. Because whiteness is different globally than it is in the United States, because it's not underpinned by a history of Jim Crow and chattel slavery in the same way. And so that's really frustrating, because in the US you want to advocate for Armenians as an oppressed group in a very real, immediate emergency kind of sense, and you're faced with the identity of diasporan Armenians who occupy very different social and economic status, and also amongst themselves have very different, social and economic statuses depending on what part of the diaspora they're from, depending on where they live, depending on their economic class. So, yeah, those things get conflated, and it makes it hard because it leaves out the people most in like the most dire situation, which are Armenians in Artsakh and to some extent in Armenia as well, who are facing existential threat and need to be seen in that context.
I just want to quickly add on that. I think, Anna, what you were saying about, the Islamophobia, or sorry, I'm going to add the Islamophobia aspect to your most recent point. There was a few moments during the 2020 war where I was kind of watching some of my peers, some of whom I know personally, analysts, human rights activists, journalists who focus on the region and were completely silent during the war, or if they shared anything, it was like, one very commendable kind of letter written by Azerbaijani peace activists. That was the only thing they shared. Yeah. And I remember, having this conversation over and over. Some people would ask me, why are they not saying anything? And I still don't have an answer. I still don't know. But my suspicion, I think some of them saw us as equal in terms of power, but they didn't want to be seen as Islamophobic by necessarily kind of speaking out against the violence. I honestly think that's one of the reasons. I mean, I think, the reasoning is quite complex and there's lots of pieces to it, but I think that's one of the major ones.
Yeah, I can see that being the case.
Well, because there's been also some history of because Armenians and Christianity is extremely tied. Like I'm a Christian, or it's it's like a part of my life. But Christianity is quite tied to Armenian identity, and it's also beyond a religious belief. It's also a cultural marker. So it is targeted by Azerbaijan and Turkey in trying to erase Armenian-ness because it's a cultural marker, but it's not a religious conflict. And I think that we've advocated around that Christianity before, which has, and certainly Armenians have participated in Islamophobia before. And I think Gadi and I try really fucking hard to that's why we're trying to be very clear with our terms and what we're talking about, because just because it doesn't fit into the Western idea of or Western liberal leftist idea of what is oppression. Of who is oppressed and who is not does not They think of it based on identity markers, when in reality it's this is a calculation of power.
Exactly, and this is another kind of exploitation of the U.S. system where people will actually self-censor or not kind of speak out against literal violence happening right now because they see if Armenians are Christian, they're probably more privileged globally.
Yeah, for sure. But this is also why leftists and liberals in the U.S. really struggle with caste in India because it's so beyond their idea of oppression and racial identity. And I mean, this has happened. There have been as many more people immigrate from India to the United States, casteism is also exported, and export is a weird way to, is also it comes with that as well, because people have access to travel and things like that. It's often upper caste wealthy people. And that's created a lot of universities now in the US, or I wouldn't say a lot, some universities in the US now are adopting anti-caste policies or anti-caste discrimination policies, because it's becoming a real issue that lower caste and Dalit people are facing when living in the United States. And the thing is, the oppressor's argument becomes, well, this is anti-Hindu, this is anti-Indian, and that's a really easy way to bamboozle left-wing identity, people who are steeped in identity politics. And this isn't me knocking identity politics as an entire. We've been freaking quoting James Baldwin this whole time. That's not the goal here. But it is to say that identity is complicated and different, and we have to sort of the U.S. is not the only empire in this world. It's not the only oppressor in this world. And when looking at a world of many different oppressors and many different empires, some of which are much more relevant to some people's lives, right? Our Armenians' lives, or the Russian Empire is much more relevant to their lives. The Turkish Empire is much more relevant to their lives than the American one in this particular moment. And so, that's just something we have to, I don't know, these conversations have to be had with a lot of specificity. And that's not I think people get they're well, now we can't generalize at all. We can't make any broad theses. That's not true. Specificity and being able to identify these things does not prevent you from being able to have broader theses and like drawing out broader conclusions, which are vital for, I don't know, struggle. But they're also like, they have to be borne out by reality. Like you can't like, you can't just create more and more subaltern people just because like you're uncomfortable really parsing out who is oppressing them and what's affecting them the most. So yeah, Armenians really like, I think we've also done not a great job of it because we've weaponized some of our privileges in ways that I think in the long run, really to our own detriment. Because it's prevented us from being able to form alliances with groups that we have natural and like whose struggles are vital to ours and like who don't even know that our struggle is vital to theirs.
Yeah. So a couple of things, and we have to kind of slowly wrap up because
oh my God,
2 hours.
yeah.
But so one thing on cast, I'll show you guys. Like, there's this book that So you know it, good. Okay.
Oh wait, you should say it out loud.
Yeah. So I'm gonna have her on. It's a book called The Trauma of Caste: A Dalit Feminist Meditation on Survivorship, Healing, and Abolition by Tinmozi Sundararajan. Apologies if I butchered the family name. She was on the podcast. She was on the Conspirituality podcast as well. Folks can listen to that one. It was a really, really good episode. But so I forgot what the second thing was.
Sorry,
it's okay. It doesn't matter. It's okay. But so with that in mind, let us, if it's okay to kind of wrap up. And I usually ask folks to do a bit of homework, in which I ask them to just recommend 1, 2, 3 books, however many they want to recommend, and usually on any topic. It doesn't have to be on the topic that we've been discussing. Well, it can be. So kind of up to you, and then we'll say goodbye to the patient soldiers who have survived until now. Thank you for listening,
made it to the end
listeners.
of this. My God,
you made it. You're amazing.
You're here.
Okay, Karena, you want to go first?
So my book would be the one that I mentioned earlier in the podcast. It's called The Politics of Exile, and it's written by Elizabeth Dauphiné. Her family name is spelled Dauphinee. And again, it's kind of a meditation on, whether, one can be objective in kind of hell times like war.
Nana?
Oh God. Whenever somebody asks me for something to read, it flies out of my brain instantly. I would say I'm like living in the U.S. right now, so this is but like I would say like it's not a book, but Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis. It made me a lot more empathetic to my own people in a very bizarre way. But yeah.
Cool. I've read that book. It's really good. Yeah. Okay. And now I'm also recommending stuff, and I'm currently reading The Dawn of Everything by the two Davids, Graeber and Wenbro, and it's amazing. So just that. And I should say, like, I've worked, and this is kind of a final thing, like I've worked in a lot of different fields, usually related to writing, but to this day I'm very bad at reviewing books. I'm like, this book I like, this book no like. That's my opinion on books. I like book. I don't like book. That's it.
I forget instantly what I've read and what I am reading the second somebody asks me about it. So I'm going to get off this call and be like, I should have said that book and I should have said the other book. It's so bad.
It's fine. And the books we mentioned, as always, I'll mention them in the show notes. With that in mind, thank you both for listening. Thank you both for participating in this amazing chat. I think it's fair to say that we have solved the world's problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think whiteness has been resolved. Armenia is fine. All is good in the world, which is, it's what you can hope for with podcasts, right? Like that's kind of the scope of what I'm trying to do here.
I think this is the platonic podcast. This is it.
This is it. Listeners, after listening to this, feel free to check the news, and you'll see that things are fine now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go on, do it. Do it right now.
Do it now. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.